Two Wood for a Wheat is a board game podcast. We review and criticize board games, diving deep into the strategies and mechanisms that make them great or make them forgettable.
So welcome to Two Wood for a Wheat. My name's Tony Faber.
I'm Pat Flannery. Today, we'll be reviewing Peter McPherson's Fit to Print, the now real-time edition in the long line of flat-out games. This is a real-time tile-laying game where you're trying to suboptimally but efficiently as possible lay out the front page of your newspaper across the weekend edition. Then we're discussing time restrictions and the effects that they have on gameplay and the effects that they have on social status while playing games.
How you doing, Pat?
I'm doing well. How are you, Tony?
I'm doing good. I'm a little groggy this morning because of a little late-night Baldur's Gate with a friend last night.
What time were you up to?
About 2.
Wow.
Which, is not excessive for most people, but when you're an old man, But my wife's away visiting friends over the weekend, so I'm living a little.
It's the time to play board games and video games when your wife is away and you just slip into a bit of juvenile habits, like playing games. What is Baldur's Gate?
Baldur's Gate is a computer game implementation of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
Okay.
Done by Lyrian Studios, which did the very popular video game Divinity Original Sin, I believe a couple years ago. This version is very well done. If you don't like D&D, you're not going to like this game, but it's got a good storyline, it's got good graphics, it executes the mechanisms of the game well. You can play around with different party members, which makes things easier or harder. You can make interesting choices, which have weird effects on the stories and have unpredictable things happen. It's got an original high fantasy storyline.
Is it like Diablo, where it's a loot, like kill and loot, or is it more along the lines of a Witcher or a Skyrim?
It's more along the lines of a Witcher in plot, although you are killing and looting things. It's not like a real-time kill things and drop things. And if you're like me and you set the difficulty on the hardest level, you really have to tactically plan your battles and plan out your group of adventurers if you're going to do okay and win those battles. Yeah, so it's interesting both from a story perspective and from a tactical perspective. It's addictive enough that you want to try to play it through taking different choices or using a different kind of party, and I'm playing it solo, and then I have friends who want to play with, and, that's sort of a different experience. Multiplayer is a lot of fun, although only you kind of have to be on the same page as far as the story choices you're making.
Yeah, I imagine playing through a novel with others gets not fun in a way if somebody's trying to make other decisions than what you were trying to do.
In our first multiplayer playthrough, there was 3 of us, and we went into the main first town where you could get different quests, and all 3 of us went in different directions in that town and started making different contradictory choices.
Uh-oh.
And one player started screaming, "What is happening?"
The town just implodes. What did you do?
One of us was like, "We're going to help you, and we're going to help all the little children in town." The other of us was like murdering and stealing in a different part of the town.
Hopefully not the children that you were trying to help.
I don't think so. Although, no. There's some very dark elements you can play into in the story if you want to. Anyway, it sort of has a board game feel. I mean, it's a turn-based game. I like that nice feel is that you kind of move along in real time, and then when combat starts, it moves into turn-based mode. And for an old man like me who doesn't want to, do things based on their twitch reflexes, that's the way to go.
As we're discussing today, real time can be heavy pressure on making decisions.
Yeah, and when your brain and your reflexes have slowed a little bit with age, that can be challenging.
When your fingers discorporate into sausages, it's hard to be fast.
How about you, Pat? Have you been playing any other board games?
I have, and I'll tell you about it as soon as you exit all of your Discord windows, which I can hear.
Oh, Discord. It's a determined little app.
It is. It has that bup-bup, bup-bup, bup-bup.
Yeah.
It seems to percolate into everything. My wife says, "What is that bup-bup noise?" And I'm like, "It's Discord." Well, exit it. And then 2 days later, "What is that bup-bup noise?" Well, it's Discord.
Speaking of annoying and unexpected noises, with my wife being away for the weekend, if you suddenly hear whines or barks or me cursing at whines or barks that you can't hear, I've had to sort of shepherd all the dogs into the recording room, because if I have them outside the recording room, they'll just be outside barking and whining.
Yeah.
They seem to be settling into the little beds that I brought downstairs here
Okay.
for them. But if something changes, I'll have
You
to
know,
let
it's a
know.
return to form, the pup doggy hour of the podcast, and editing out the odd bark and growl. That seems familiar.
I think it's going to be okay.
Okay. Well, Tony, what have I been playing? I tried out on Tabletop Simulator Harvest 2nd Edition. I just need to preempt this. I am so glad that Trade Chambers Harvest is getting a reprint. I think the original edition is an excellent game. I've had it for, I think, 4 years. I bought it for about $30 back then and just loved every play of it. I've probably played it 2 dozen times. I think this game needed a reprint, and I want lots of people to experience it.
Yeah,
but
it's always been that big worker placement game in a small box that you can play in under an hour, but it has a lot of meaty, interesting decisions. And when we talk about meaty game in a small box in a small time frame, this is always at the top of our list.
Yeah, and I think the way that Harvest is produced, the standout elements of it are the fact that there's different elements that are coupled together, both from a production and a mechanics perspective. In Harvest, what you're doing is you are farmers with a farm plot, and it manages to give you a lot. It's a worker placement game, but before you even start placing your workers, you have these sunrise cards, which you draft. The earlier that the number is, the earlier that you get up, you're going to establish turn order 1 through 15. And the thing is, on the 1 to 5 cards, it's just okay things. And then the 6 to 10 cards, it's really good effects that are paired with it. And then 11 to 15, it's extremely good effects. But you're going to be going later in the round, so when you're actually taking the round later on, you're going to have these worker placement spots that start getting eaten up. So you're balancing against...
And turn order is very important. So
it's huge. One wrong turn or one missed turn can make or break your game in a really serious way. All the while, what you're doing is you're planting out plants that you are tending, which will grow them out and double them in your farm plot, and then you're harvesting them for points. That's true for first edition and second edition. That's the same through line. Now, that's the basic gist of Harvest. There's some wacky elements that I'll get into. I do have an old man yells at cloud moment about the second edition, Tony.
You're going to get into the wacky stuff. Before you mention this, it's worth mentioning that one of the things that makes this interesting is that for a short game, it's got a lot of variable player powers in the worker placement aspect, and it was originally magical farming, and I think that's been toned down or out of the reprint.
It is, yeah. It's now Fantastic Mr. Fox style farming, where you get player powers, but gone are the Gregorgiuses of the player powers where you have an extra worker. Gone are the Bo Muds of the game where you have an extra farm plot. Gone are I forgot what it's called, but the Goblin who gives you -2 points per farm plot, but allows you to not pay anything throughout the entire game. It's much more subdued player powers outside of this magical and now kind of naturified realm that we see.
That actually makes me a little sad that they've toned down the player powers. Maybe they were balance issues.
I don't care that there were balance issues. The thing is, the original game, it had a lot of sharp edges. And this is a similar game now, but without the sharp edges. They've really roughed them all off. And the charm of the production in the first box that made the original unique is gone. Don't get me wrong. There are some improvements in this new edition. There's a little more going on in the tile lane on your board. You now need space for all of your crops when they reproduce, and they are in different shapes on the board, and when they reproduce, you have to fit that tile onto your farm plot. So you basically have to balance out reproducing your crops, tending them to grow while clearing space for them, and it's also the same areas where you lay out these buildings for extra effects and points. So it's a good tension between the two, but the spatial puzzle itself, it's not a great spatial puzzle. Like, you've got the growth of crops competing against square buildings, and there's not some overriding tension tying them together aside from just not having enough space. So it feels more like an afterthought instead of a focus, and there's nothing new nor exceptional about the tile lane. And the biggest change you're going to see, as we've mentioned, is the art. The art is going to be preferred by some people. It looks like a storyboard for Fantastic Mr. Fox with like a hipster deer and a cow in a suit. It's very cute. It's been naturified right out of Everdell or Creature Comforts. You see this everywhere with Root, and it's this anthropomorphizing of animals that everybody's gonna love. I don't necessarily like it more than the original art, which belied this quaint farm aesthetic with pockets of sort of gross and absurd characters, these absurdities that he'd only realize if he looked for too long, like the fat beaver character chomping down on a cigar that looks like a corrupt construction worker, or Landolph, the green wizard, who's clearly toking potions, and that's his power, is just loving potions and clearly getting high off of it, or Bo Mudd, the swampling, who is like straight out of a Florida fever dream. He looks like a Florida panhandle stereotype mixed with an actual swamp thing. Or the frequent plant puns like Scarrets and Rockley that you found in the original. Instead, you get this kind of generic cuteness that you see all the time now. And frankly, it's going to get new gamers to the table, but it's kind of wearing thin for me. It feels rather stale and unoriginal to me compared to what the original was.
To be fair, Pat, I agree with you, by the way, on the I like the original art style better. But to be fair, this is partially because, that's what we encountered the game as, and it was something a bit unique, right? To be fair to the people who are putting out the new edition, this game never got the audience it deserved. And I think perhaps the art style was a part of that, and that it kind of didn't draw in as many people as they wanted to. Yep. So I understand what they're doing here to get a bigger audience. That sort of weird art style didn't sell 1 million copies, and you can't, from a marketing perspective, you can't blame them at all.
No, you're totally right. It is the game just kind of got lost in TMG, Tasty Minstrel Games. It just kind of got lost, and I'm glad that it got picked back up. And you're totally right. This kind of more generic theme that I'm used to, it's going to get people to buy this. People are going to buy this for the art and the design alone. That's great. I want to get it out there. I've kind of mentioned the changes in the characters, so I'm not going to retread over that, so to speak, that their sharp edges are taken off. But by far, my biggest disappointment with the game is the currency system, which was so unique to the original. It's now completely uncoupled from the seeds and uncoupled from the points. The original game, the small box game, the brilliance of it is that it forced all of these mechanisms together. You had these terrible decisions that you had to make because there were all of these different systems coupled. Your points were stars that were located principally on the plants that you spent planting and then tending and then harvesting for much of the game. It took so much work to get those plants out. But these stars were also the currency of the game. And you'd have these moments when you had to spend your hard-earned plants as money, thereby spending your points as well, in order to do something else. It set up these terribly agonizing decisions when you wanted to purchase a new building but had no snap peas, the kind of atomized base currency of the game. So you had to give up a plumpkin with 4 points on it as 2 currency, and you got no change back. So those 4 points are spent as 2 currency, and it's just gone. And yep, that entire system is gone. Now you get points for harvesting plants, along with you get some run-of-the-mill currency. And it's just about, let's maximize currency. It's completely decoupled from the plants, aside from the fact that you get them while you're harvesting plants. And that's really disappointing to me.
I hear you. I'm a little sad to hear that it's that big change has been made and that tension of that decision is gone. I haven't played the new version. I can't speak to whether the new version plays as a more interesting game or not. But I did like that tension a lot that you're talking about.
Yeah. I don't know if you're going to play the new version, Tony, because the new version, the peculiarities that are going, it's starting to feel an awful lot like a generic run-of-the-mill worker placement game now. It no longer has the dense small box charm of the original, where plants equaled money, equaled points, and where several components served as multiple uses. But Tony, the real reason I think you're not going to play this game is the pricing is exorbitant. How much? You haven't looked at the Kickstarter, right?
No, and okay. Well, I own the original game, so there's no reason for me to go buy it again.
Okay, how much would you spend on the original?
Well, if it was some deluxeified version from Kickstarter, which I'm sure this is, I might go as high as $50.
Okay. Well, the base level for this game is $59. Oof. Yeah. The deluxe version of this light medium game is $89.
What are you getting some actual magic beans in the box?
I would expect that they have a real fox included in the box, and with a lifetime supply of veterinary pills and a lifetime subscription to your local vet. That's what I would expect. Tony, there is a super deluxe edition that happens to include stitched playmats and animeeples that is $149. I am sorry. Harvest is a good game, but $149 is simply too much money for what is a light medium game. The Super Deluxe version ostensibly just provides some animeeples and stitch playmats. There's no gameplay improvements whatsoever. I think the only justification for it is someone buying this as an art piece rather than a game. I mean, you do you, but I don't see the game as having $149 worth of plays in it.
Well, I mean, I think it's really an excellent game, but part of the appeal of it was that you were getting a worker placement game for half the price of a big box worker placement game.
Right.
And if you're paying instead double the price of a big box worker placement game, it loses some of that appeal unless you're, exorbitant and incredibly wealthy. In which case, have at it.
I think the new edition is anathema to the original production and intention of the production of the first edition, which is let's have a small box game for cheap that doubles up on components and doubles up on mechanisms so that it's cheap and portable and accessible and fun. That is completely gone. I would say $59 may be digestible, but it's still just a light medium game. And now it's kind of a generic one. So if you're interested in it, try it on Tabletop Simulator. And I would suggest trying that before you go all in. So that's Harvest 2nd edition. Now on Kickstarter.
Well, that didn't really sound like a ringing endorsement, but I think
was not.
The game, I invite people to try for themselves because the original game was so good and so many things going for it that, and some people have spoken really highly of the new edition that, It may be an old curmudgeon yelling at clouds thing here. I'm not saying you particularly. I probably would do the same had I played it, but see for yourself. That's our cop-out.
Well, I have a few more games that I played, but I want to hear what you've been playing.
So besides Fit to Print, speaking of speaking of human-like animals, I went back up to the Poconos for a weekend, got to play with a good friend, Joe, and his nephew, Nathan, and the price for playing Fit to Print with me was a steep one, at least in terms of time investment. I had to join them in my first ever game of Twilight Imperium 4.
I don't know if that's a fair trade, a 20-minute game for an 8-hour one, or at least a 6-hour one.
Well, to be fair, we just played it at 3 players, managed to get through it in about 5 hours, including the teach. So I thought that was very good from at least an expectation perspective for Twilight Imperium. If you haven't heard of it, it's the monster of all space opera games of you play a race and you're out there conquering the galaxy and building ships and developing technologies and fighting other players and racing to 10 points by fulfilling various goals. And when you reach the planet in the middle of the board, then you start voting on various laws going into effect. And the game has sort of a ramp-up feel where first you're building up your fleets and then you're racing to fulfill these objectives to get to 10 victory points. It has certain things which are going to always prevent it from being one of my favorite games of all time. It's the necessity of bashing the player who's leading. I don't love. That's just a kind of a feature of this kind of games that I'm not in love with. Also, I don't love that the objectives come out very sort of randomly and one player may have already fulfilled them. So it's like they're getting free victory points, it seems like, that other players aren't, as opposed to being able to see these in advance and work towards them. But besides those two things, the game has so much charm. I can see why it's the most popular game of its type in this kind. It's all these different variable player powers, all these different quirky things happen. I like the Euro-ish action selection mechanism. I like the sort of engine building in the game. I almost wish that the space combat was more important for determining the winner of the game. And while it can have an effect, it's more about doing things to fulfill missions and goals. I actually managed to win in my first ever play, which was very luck-based on what objectives showed up. But a player who almost won was practically wiped off the map, and yet they still almost won. You feel like you can get sucked into playing the space combat game and not keep your eye on that this is really a Euro race to 10 points game. Anyway, I had a really good time. A lot of quirky and strange and goofy things happened. I wouldn't play this every day, but when I go back up there, I may play it again, and we can play it even faster. I think at a low player count, that may not have some of the diplomatic charm of people, all these huge civilizations clashing, but you can actually get the game played. We could probably get this down to 4 hours consistently and still get that epic space experience at 3 players. So yeah, I'm glad to have tried it, and I understand why people love Twilight Imperium.
And do you feel like you've checked off some gamer box, some Grail game that bucket list wise you had to play?
It's definitely on my list of games I should try. I actually played like the original Twilight Imperium, like I think not even with a number after the end of it, like 25 years ago, when it was even longer, baggier, more rules, less simple. That was a game I was glad to have played once, but wouldn't have picked up again. And this is a game I could see repeat plays of more because it's a little shorter, a little more accessible, some of the minutia streamlined out of it.
Cool. You've got me interested, and it sounds like I could probably convince you to play Eclipse, which is a further streamlined, more Eurofied version of Twilight Imperium.
You could convince me to play Eclipse. In fact, you have in the past and are our setup plays to get this done actually fell through in the past, thanks to someone who won't be named on this podcast.
Was it Boone?
It may or may not have been a certain someone whose feet my dog Paisley liked to lick.
It's always Boone.
Back in Chicago.
Boone of the tasty feet.
Yeah, I've got to make it to Chicago. That's the only thing. I will not play Eclipse via Tabletop Simulator.
Nor will I.
Unless I, am contemplating when I encourage a suicidal path.
No, that's beyond the pale for me as well. I did have another play of Nucleum on Tabletop Simulator.
Nice.
Of course, this was a two-handed play where I was playing against myself versus my previous play, which was against two other players. But I did play it two-handed with the intention of testing this hypothesis in Nucleum, that it is basically an efficiency game of trying to stretch out your rounds for as long as possible, and thinking that the greatest points come from efficiently stringing actions together to maximize electricity in order to place for the highest bonuses at the top of the achievement track. And I will say, Tony, I doubled my scores compared to my last two-handed and my competitive game. So I think that my theory is ringing true at this point, that Nucleum is base level in an efficiency game, stringing together your turns within a single round. And I'm still enjoying Nucleum, and I hope that someone ferries it across the pond to play. And I've got another game set up against Varianor and Enoch coming soon in the next week or so.
And so that's not a negative for you, that it's that kind of efficiency puzzle. I mean, all of Luciani's games are really efficiency puzzles. Not so much David Turczi's games, but so that's not much of a surprise, right?
Well, and unlike just being an efficiency puzzle, I mean, you take Barrage and you say, well, I've got 12 workers and I need to make sure that I use these 12 workers well. No, this one says you've got 3 workers and this space will give you another worker, which will allow you to take another action, which will give you money, which you use for another action, which will give you more workers, which will give you more actions, and so on and so forth until you've done as much as you possibly can, a la Discordia, a la Hadrian's Wall. It is that sort of game, ultimately, paired to Barrage. And those are some of my favorites. I love those sorts of games, so I'm enjoying Nucleum.
Nature calls this old man.
Go for it.
This is going to be tricky because the dogs have settled in so nicely and they're not going to like me leaving. Okay, I have returned. That effort at quiet escape was kind of a disaster there. I don't know if you could hear it.
There was a lot of barking and growling.
But I tried tiptoeing past the dog's bed, but I must have rolled a critical failure because I somehow got my foot in a loop of my microphone cord and tripped face first, almost smushing both the dogs in the bed and waking everybody up.
Oh my God. I watched the Dungeons and Dragons movie, which I don't have too much to say about it. It's fun. But Tina, who has no basis
Popcorn movie, right? Movie. That's the 2-word review. Yep.
Great popcorn movie. Perfect popcorn movie. Well done. But Tina, who was watching it with me, was like, why are these people so stupid and bad at what they do? And I said, that's the point. It's like they're rolling dice and they're doing a bad job. That's the fun of it.
That is. And this is the secret to any good role-playing game. It's not, when players do everything efficiently and perfectly, the game is kind of dull. It's when you create a plan and everything goes horribly, horribly, hilariously wrong that role-playing games are fun.
Which perhaps could be sad about our future review, which we'll get into in a moment here. But yeah. I do have one more game to speak of, and that is Knarr, the new Viking-themed game on Board Game Arena currently. Knarr is ostensibly a game about playing out cards. The base level is you've got a card selection made up of 5 colors, and you've got cards in your hand. And whenever you play a card from your hand, you will get a bonus at the top of that card. You will get a bonus for all of the cards of that color that are already in your tableau. And then you will get the ability to purchase a card from the market. And if it is of the same color, then it is free, which is nice. And this is a game where you are racing to 40 points. And instead of doing that card play, you can also choose to explore lands. And you will take cards from your tableau, those Vikings in your tableau, and spend them in the allotted amount per land. Let's say you might need to spend 3 green and 2 yellow in order to get that tasty 9-point land up at the top. And you'll effectively buy victory points and other abilities. Now, Tony, the main thing about Knarr is the game is all about speed, because this game is a race to only 40 points and it can be played in 10 minutes. It's impressive to me that the game has some coupled and weighty decisions within that 10 minutes of decision space, which means that it's a dense game that's also very replayable. The most interesting decision is which card to play, and it does a lot of work. I mean, the card that you play, it reactivates cards of that color in your tableau. It gives you a base level bonus. It dictates which card from the selection is free to purchase, and it could also set you up for a travel to one of the benefit-laden lands, and any of these factors may sway your decision of which card to play. And I will say there are several viable strategies that work at odds with one another. You could build a massive tableau and reactivate cards of the same color for points and influence. Influence will give you points per round. You could constantly dismantle your tableau, buying lands for points and benefits. You could instead get lots and lots of lands, which when you do this secondary action of trading, you trade these silver trinkets, which will get to your lands, which will activate the trade bonuses of those lands, be it points or more influence or more recruitment ability. And so you could trade jewelry and retrigger the obtainment of benefits from the lands in your tableau. So the game end trigger is 40 points, and someone is usually getting 1 to 3 points per round from influence. And some of the lands that you are playing into your tableau are worth 9 points alone. So you can see how this game just flashes by. Knarr, it is really impressive that they fit this much into a 10-minute game, and I suggest that you try out Knarr for yourself on Board Game Arena.
Sounds like you are impressed by this one out of the gate.
I am. I don't think it's like the most fun or the most complex game, but for how much it fits in within 10 minutes, it is fairly impressive.
I'll have to give that a shot.
Anything else by you, Tony, or should we jump into this
jump right in.
Craziness of Fit to Print?
Fit to Print, which was a Kickstarter, I believe, from Flat Out Games, soon to be appearing in retail from AEG, and one of our favorite game publishing companies. But rather than this being designed by their usual crew, which did Point Salad, and then developed games such as Cascadia and Verdant and Calico, etc., this game was actually designed by Peter McPherson. If you don't know that name, that's the designer of Tiny Towns, perhaps my favorite spatial puzzle game ever designed. So he also did a game called Wormholes, which Mitch and I covered back on the B-side, which we found
Unsure, you and I covered it.
You and I covered Wormholes?
Yeah, you played it with Mitch, and Mitch
I played it with Mitch.
Totally smashed you and took all of the things that he wanted, so he didn't like it. I quite liked Wormholes and would definitely play it more.
I found Wormholes to be okay. This was one of those games that Mitch didn't like, and his dislike of the game may have carried over, made it less fun for me to play. So blame Mitch. He's not here. He doesn't mind.
As I recall, he smashed you, and that's why he didn't like it, and he thought it was fine. But
that's not what I recall. But maybe you're just trolling me, and the fact that I have an old man's memory as to exactly what happened.
That's right.
So anyway, Peter McPherson designed Tiny Towns and Wormholes. I was quite excited to see what a designer I liked would be doing with a game developed by the Flat Out Games crew. And also, one thing that intrigued me was that this was a spatial puzzle in real time. So should I begin by describing the mechanisms of this game?
Please. How about it?
It's also
You've got 4 minutes to describe this. That's it. And you must also play a game while describing it. Go.
I don't think I can play Go at the same time as describing it. It's a little too deep. So yeah, it's got the it's got the human-like animals that.
Do you have difficulty saying the word anthropomorphized?
Anthropomorphized
That's
animals.
the second time that you've subbed in human-like animals instead of anthropomorphized animals.
You know, I had a friend who I was playing Baldur's Gate 3 with, I think, who was trying to pronounce anthropomorphized about 5 times and saying it like a different way each time, and I kept correcting them until the point where I couldn't remember how to say the word.
It's like when you say roof 5 different times, then it starts to be apparent how strange of a word roof is. Roof, 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 roof.
Well, you're from the Midwest, so you say roof, right?
I don't know anymore.
Anyway, so I'm just blaming an unnamed friend here for this, taking no responsibility whatsoever for my inability to pronounce words anymore.
Nor should you, and he's not here to defend himself, so power to you.
Exactly. So anyway, in this spatial puzzle game, what you are doing, it's called Fit to Print, and the theme fits well with the real-time mechanisms because you're trying to get a newspaper out the door. Stories chosen and laid out and scoring the most points for efficiently laying out your stories, your advertisements, and your pictures on your own personal player board. So how this works is that A timer is started at the beginning of each of 3 rounds, and after the timer goes off, players start picking pieces, which are, I won't call them polyominoes because they're all basically rectangles, rectangular upside down pieces from a pile in the middle, examining them, and then choosing whether to keep them and putting them on your little printing table or put them back in the middle face up. This may sound familiar from games such as Galaxy Trucker, most notably, right? When you've gotten what you think are enough pieces to fill your newspaper, you say layout, and you start then putting those pieces on.
Sorry, you scream layout.
You scream layout, and you start putting those pieces on your personal player board, an area of space, and you have certain restrictions based to score the most points. You'll have stories that are worth a certain amount of points, but they cannot be laid next to other stories of that type. And then you have photographs, which give you points per story of a particular type around them, but you can't put photographs next to each other. And finally, you'll have advertisements, which you're laying down. And to get the value of them, you can't put ads next to ads because who wants to see that many ads, really, right? And ads don't get you points, but what they do is, this is a mechanism culled from Reiner Knitz's High Society, is the person who has the least ad revenue at the end of the game loses, and their newspaper goes out of business. Anyhow, so you don't want to lose, right? So you've got to sort of push your luck with how much ad revenue you're getting at the same time. And there's also other ways to lose points. If you have leftover tiles that you don't use, you will lose a lot of points, a point for each of those tiles left over. And if you have white space, depending on how much white space that you've left over by not fulfilling areas of your board, you'll also lose points. The white space actually hurts you twice because it means you're also putting fewer things on your board if you've got white space left over. And fitting all those pieces next to each other in various ways is harder than it appears, especially when you've got a real-time pressure sitting on you. Also, the tiles cannot be rotated every way. The print has to be straight up, right? And by the way, if you notice after the end of the round that you've laid something out wrong, which definitely happens, then you actually have to flip tiles over to have that layout be okay. And there's sort of a blank space on the other side, and then you don't get the points for whatever you have to flip over. But I should have mentioned the most important rule, which is when you are done laying out, you get to yell print, and then you get to choose in the order that you finish for the next round a special player power, which is the centerpiece of your newspaper, which gives you a certain amount of points or special player powers, which you can then execute in the following round. So there's an incentive in the first and second rounds to finish laying out your newspaper first. And then you tally up how many points you got. You tally up how much ad revenue, so you know how you're doing in that crucial ad revenue thing going into the next round. And then you do it again with a slightly bigger space in the second and third rounds. It's a Friday, Saturday, Sunday game is what they call it. And after 3 rounds, you add up the points, you laugh mercilessly at the person with the least ad revenue, and you declare a winner. And the rounds, by the way, they recommend between 3 and 5 minutes. So all the games I played, a number of games were at 5 minutes, and which is their relaxed time period, and it's not that relaxed.
Especially on Sundays.
Especially on the last round, although on the last round you're at least getting the hang of things more. You feel like the third time through, at least your brain has been oiled to lay these things out properly. I will say that, and this is sort of transitioning to the review part of it, you inevitably find, no matter how efficiently you think you did things, and no matter how you finally think you've mastered the spatial puzzle, that you inevitably find at least one boneheaded mistake, like that you forgot that these two photos can't go next to each other, or these you've done something wrong. You forgot the whole thing about mood balance. Oh, mood balance is the other thing that I didn't say. Half the stories are positive and half are negative. And you don't want a fluffy newspaper just with all positive stories, and you don't want one that's too depressing. So you have to have a balance. And so the difference between your positive and negative stories, indicated by sad or smiley faces on the stories, also is an amount of points you lose. If you forget that, or get that wrong, and by the way, if you lay out two things next to each other and have to flip a tile over, there's a cascading effect, because now the balance of your negative and positive is off as well, and all of a sudden all your points for the round are going out the window. Your thoughts, Pat?
Tony, fit to print, there's a certain brilliance in the fact that it is a 2-part game. The first one being grabbing tiles, and the second one being laying out those tiles.
2 parts by 3 parts, you could say, actually. 2 parts by 3 rounds. Yeah.
Because you do it over 3 rounds, correct. But this idea that you are grabbing tiles which then dictate and hold you to the possible scoring ceiling, you've unknowingly set a ceiling for yourself within that grabbing of those tiles. And within that second portion where you're actually laying those tiles out, you're deducing how high that ceiling is, where that ceiling is, and you're on a very tight clock to do so. Your tile selection will never be perfect. And so Fit to Print is a game that breeds comfort in imperfection. With that being said, there's a certain anxiety with that you just have to accept. That what you've done during the tile grabbing phase is imperfect. It's never going to be right. You're never going to be able to mathematize the optimal level of tiles and different types of articles and how they might all fit together on the board because it's completely separate. The grabbing, you cannot lay out and start testing out tiles onto the board while grabbing. So you just have to kind of fudge it. And it's inherently imperfect, therefore. So once you accept that, and that gives way, you're reveling in this discomfort of abstraction, of this fudging. There's simply too many variables to have a right layout between balance and mood, white space, maximizing photos, assessing the centerpiece tile, and fitting articles, especially given the jumble that you've just selected. At some point, with this sword of Damocles hanging above your head, you simply have to say, good enough. And I find that aspect very freeing, that I can let go of perfectionism while playing this game.
Yeah, it's definitely something where certain people are not going to like this game because they don't like real-time games and they don't like those imperfections and they don't like having to groan at having done it wrong, and that will gnaw at them. And that's fair enough, right, for certain perfectionist players. But yeah, I did enjoy and felt liberated by those things and enjoyed people's mistakes are, again, the fun of the game, right? Which we were talking about in our previous section about role-playing games, right?
Yeah.
This is one of those things where laughing at somebody who's just put all their ads next to each other and just has to flip everything over and loses all their points that's the joy of the game. If everybody just did it almost perfectly, then that wouldn't be a lot of fun.
Yeah, or somebody who just got 25, 30 points in articles, but totally forgot in their haste that advertisements are a secondary incentive that you need to play in order to not get kicked out of the game. And they're doing extremely well, only to be pushed out of the game entirely. That is hilarious.
And it's very hilarious when somebody's behind on ads going into the last round, and the other two players think, well, I'm not going to lose. And then all that third player does is place like 30 ads on their board in the last round.
Right.
And because of that, they don't get enough points to win, but they do spoiler somebody and pass somebody for ad revenue and kick them out of the game. You know, there are these funny moments that go along with this, right?
There are.
What do you think in terms of gameplay? I think I want to just reemphasize that point about not being able to place the tiles on your board to see how they're going to fit until you've already drafted the tiles. So there's often this, oh no, I've taken too much or too little. And even if you've calculated everything exactly, if you have the right amount of positive and negative, you have the right photos for your stories, if you have the right amount of ad revenue, and you've even chosen the right amount of space, there's a push your luck element in that you don't know how those different pieces, because you can't test them in advance, are going to actually fill that space. So you may have just the right amount of space to fill your paper, but they don't fit together right to actually fill that space. And then you have to leave out crucial things, and leaving out crucial things leaves you short on ad revenue or throws off your mood balance.
Yeah.
Or you take it a little easier and you draft fewer pieces so that you know you can fit it all, but then you're taking a white space penalty, and then you're just not getting as many things on your board.
Or you take a bunch of extra pieces so that you have lots of options, only to get inundated with the spoiled for choice, basically, and run out of time and have 5 different tiles still left on your board,
and lose a ton of points.
Lose a ton of points for it. So yeah, your tile laying puzzle is always a mild disaster of your own making.
That's a great way of putting it. And I think it also leads to how ultimately what I think of this game and how much I want to play it is that this is sort of the perfect filler game, because it's a game that gives you a boost of energy, which real-time games tend to do anyway. But also those kind of disasters make you sort of laugh, make you think. It's the perfect game at the beginning or the end of an evening, or while you're waiting for somebody to show up between games, because it's memorable, it makes people laugh, it gives you that jolt of energy. But it's not a game you want to sit down and go, okay, let's play this for the meat of our evening 4 times in a row. You don't want to play it so much, I think, that this game feels solved or that everyone's executing perfectly. If you play it only sometimes, then people will play it badly. And that's when I think the game's at its best.
Yeah, I think it's hilarious. And the gameplay is technically very fast. I mean, depending on how crazed you are, the actual gameplay is only between 9 and 15 minutes and will probably be 12 minutes with each news day lasting about 4 minutes. And there's a density of decisions in that time that the time feels well spent and crunchy, while also meaning that the game is surprisingly immediately replayable. You could, and I have played it 2 times in a row, because there's enough decision there and a goodness enough of the essential tile laying puzzle while being fast enough to get it out multiple times. And I will say, considering how much is up to that random flip of the tile, the game is very puzzly. So the puzzle of solving for something that's non-optimal without a best solution, it is very fun. For example, you may have selected 4 pink articles because your centerpiece scores for pink tiles above the fold, and the rest of the tiles that you grabbed are pretty much blue tiles, ads, and photos that score for pink and blue. Sounds great, sounds optimal. But maybe your above the fold space isn't quite big enough for all 4 of those pink tiles. And maybe they're crammed together and they are touching, and you can't have that because then you're going to have to flip a bunch of them. So you've already laid out your top and your bottom, and now you have to reconfigure and rejigger everything. And maybe you selected initially the perfect relative shapes for blue tiles, only to realize that similar articles can't touch, and suddenly you are stacking ads between them, which is pushing them further apart, and suddenly they don't fit on your page anymore, which means you have to pull the pink tiles from above the fold to slot in between them, which is docking points on your photos and from your centerpiece. Pretty soon, you're just finding a resting homeostasis where you're scoring enough points for articles and enough points for photos and enough points for your centerpiece tile, reducing your leftover tiles enough, minimizing white space enough. And although all the while, you probably forgot to put enough ads to pay or you forgot to pay attention to your mood. There's a lot to consider in that crunchy little puzzle. The essential puzzle gameplay is quite good.
Yeah, it fits with the theme of, rushing a newspaper out the door and saying, good enough, right? And it also, I think I'm going to reemphasize that it gives me the opposite feel that I have from some other games, which is when I enjoy a game, I want to play it over and over and over again to get better and better and hone my craft. Mm-hmm. In this game, I just don't want myself or another player to get so good at the game that it feels like they can, have mastered it. You want those disasters to be there.
Yeah, although I will say, there are ways, and I totally agree with that. You want the disasters to be there. They're fun. That's the fun of it. But there is enough crunch in order to get better at this game. The fact that there's too much to think about for the time that you have means that the gameplay's decision space density is technically about that of a black hole, only computable by a PhD mathematician, but you only have the time to compute it of a 6th grade algebra student. And that's what you're rocking. That's what you're rolling with.
And by the way, I would strongly recommend, if you get to where you're mastering the game at 5 minutes, decrease that time limit. Make it harder and use the time limit to enforce mistakes, and then balance your skill level that way. And
believe me,
and you could even, by the way, if you have somebody who's mastered this game, give them a different time limit than a new player.
You could. That being said, it's not just the tile lane that is something that it can improve at. Actually, the tile grabbing phase, it has enough hints to allow you to play okay and actually get better at it, because some tiles are face up from previous rounds, and also every tile actually has text written in the back indicating whether it is a 1x4 or a 4x1, let's say. So you can see whether it's horizontal or it is vertical. So you can start to say, well, I've got a bunch of horizontal tiles now, and I have a feeling in the back of my head that I am going to need lots of vertical tiles to put in between them. So you start flipping those over instead. And there is there's a kind of comfort in that you can solidly fudge the tile grabbing phase and know that you need a certain balance between different types of tiles in order to get a sense of having options as you start actually laying out the tiles. And you can even overgrab the number of tiles so that you have a wider selection to play. But again, not only are you losing time, you're also losing points for having more tiles than what you can fit on your board. So although you're spoiled for choice, you have less ability to efficiently play tiles, and you also are reducing your overall points.
Yeah, assessing the face-up tiles that other people have turned up and not taken, and using that to change gears all of a sudden, that's like something that does not happen in your first play of this game, but that's one of those skills you can develop, as you said.
Mm-hmm. There's certain elements that feel like they were added beyond the core gameplay that I just want to touch on. The advertisements. They feel like a later design addition, but I think that they're brilliant. They don't give you any score, but you need to play them in order to not lose the game. And it adds this completely counter-incentive secondary system that's as important as the primary one, but balances against everything else in the game. It's as important, it's as big, and it is there next to all of the photos and articles and centerpiece. It needs to be in balance with it. Now, mood also feels like a later addition, and it's my one disappointment of the game. Mood being that you have to balance happy and sad, but mood, it feels secondarily tethered to the other aspects of the game, like article color and article shape, which are kind of your primary thoughts while grabbing tiles, so as to feel like random noise. Like, you're so unlikely to find a 3x4 double happy face, realize sort of generally that that's bad for your mood balance, and then seek out a 3x4 double sad face instead. You'll never find it. So you probably take baseline what you think will work for you based off of the tile shape and color rather than the mood.
I will disagree with you on this one point. I like the mood balance, and the mood balance is always the first thing actually I consider in getting right in this game. But I just like that it adds the complication, which makes the puzzle harder, and that it makes it, so you can't score. And I also like the cascading failure when you have to flip something over because you put two things next to each other. Now your mood balance is off as well, and you lose even more points. Mm-hmm. And not every game do I like these masochistic elements, but here in a short filler game, it works. The same thing with what you were talking about before, losing the game because of ad revenue. Long game don't like automatic loss elimination punishing mechanisms, but in this short fast game it works perfectly. And it also can create a certain meta at your table. If people are grabbing advertisements like crazy, well, then you've got to do it too, or you're going to lose, right?
Yeah.
So it can be this thing where everybody's taking a little slow in the ads, or everybody's desperately scrambling to get tons of ads, and it makes you pay attention to what the other players are doing.
And frankly, if you don't like the automatic elimination, you can always use the 2-player rules, which just say the person with the least advertisements gets docked 10 points. And that's a bit fairer.
Sure. There is a if you don't like real time, there is a turn-based version, but I think if you don't like real time at all, then why are you buying this game?
Play Calico, play Cascadia,
yeah,
play
a different game.
Yeah. The solo mode, surprisingly good. Like Calico, Cascadia, and Verdant, Fit to Print is a game system with some simple variables that can be toggled, like the headline cards, like the centerpiece tiles. And it presents you with about 20 scenarios in the back of the book to try solo, varying difficulty, easy to hard. And I played through about a third of them, and they are difficult via the headline tiles and, they're breaking news tiles, not headline tiles. So via the breaking news tiles and the centerpiece tile cards, they're designed to show off different aspects of the game, forcing you to focus on tile layout or forcing you to focus on advertisement or photo placement or something else, all while keeping in mind every other aspect of the game. It's this other round of mental gymnastics and flaming hoops by Flat Out Games that forces you to completely explore the game system, and that I enjoy quite a lot. I enjoy them giving you the opportunities to fully explore their game and its various mechanisms.
Yeah, agree with everything you just said. So that is Fit to Print from Flat Out Games.
A worthy addition to a collection of Flat Out game connoisseurs. If you enjoy Calico and if you enjoy Cascadia or Verdant, I would definitely pick up Fit to Print as well.
From here, we're going to transition into a topic which is partially about real-time games, but is really about the amount of real-time you have to make decisions, which can affect games that are not necessarily real-time games. There's a social element to this as well, in terms of how long you take to make your move, and there's also different elements which can come in depending on a game mode that you're using. Perhaps in a place such as Board Game Arena, where you're playing a at the table, so to speak, version of the game, where you actually have a timer for how long you have to make your moves for social reasons, or the turn-based, almost play-by-mail version where you have forever to consider your moves, and the different considerations that brings to a game and how it changes the enjoyment of a game we play.
So, just to lay this out, I want to talk about this very demented and depraved play of Eclipse that I had a few years ago, where we had a 6-player game of Eclipse with 3 new players that we needed to finish in 2.5 hours. And normally this would be a 4-hour game with that many people. But there was the boyfriend of one of the folks there. He got out a stopwatch. And it was basically like he was on a megaphone. and he'd give you 30 seconds to take your turn. And if you went over, he'd say, go, 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 take your turn. And you'd say, yeah, okay, take my turn. And it forced this really demented play where there were people who had played for 30 minutes, had invaded a sector, and already were completely knocked out of the game. All of their spaceships were blown up and their home planet was conquered. I saw people do such suboptimal moves inside of that game. It was a grand spectacle of stupidity. By the end, we all said, well, we only have a few minutes left. What do we do? Somebody said, let's all just fight in the middle. So we said, okay, because we didn't have any time to think about it. And we all just fought in the middle for about 20 minutes until nobody was left except for one person. And that person became the victor. And it was stupid, but man, was it memorable. And sometimes suboptimal moves are interesting, and sometimes time restrictions force that kind of play.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about chess tournaments, which is where a lot of this comes, the timer is the original source of timing your moves in games, the chess clock, right? The shorter time control games can be more interesting because there are more mistakes, like you're talking about, right? And when you see chess masters make mistakes in a blitz game, you'll see the person who's ahead go back and forth many times sometimes in a blitz game, whereas in a long game, it can be more of a you've got an advantage and the master doesn't make enough mistakes to change who's got that advantage throughout the entire game, right? They've got a stranglehold on it, right? Mm-hmm. Unpredictability is a thing, right? So there's something to that if you can flow with certain time restrictions in games. Now, I mean, obviously, I wouldn't recommend having somebody, chanting over somebody's shoulder in every game.
Generally not an enjoyable experience, no.
I used to play tournament collectible games, which I kind of got out of because I didn't want to have my whole life be about studying what new pieces were coming out in this game, right? But this miniatures game, War Machine, I would play in tournaments. And when I first played the game, tournaments were just basically, there was no chess clock. You just took however long you took with your turn. And if your game went past the round timer, they would just call it and assess who's ahead at that point based on a point system. And it was terrible in a tournament sense. It was totally abusable. If you were ahead, you could just stall and just take forever on your turn, right?
Yeah,
and so as the tournament scene got a little more serious, that obviously just didn't work. So they started using chess clocks. And there's so many cool things that happened. If somebody's ahead, but they're down to 5 minutes on their chess clock and they're just moving maniacally, right? It still didn't work perfectly for a miniatures game where you have to move these pieces in precise distances across the board. But it really did create a pressure of, mistakes are going to be made by somebody in time, pressure, and the clock, so you can't just sit there forever and plan out this perfect strategy, and it creates a long game moving a little faster. So I tend to enjoy time constraints in games, even when my play suffers as a result.
I tend to not, because for whatever reason, I do not trust that my level of experience is commensurate with that of the other folks who have a level of experience within a time-based game. And this is specifically to Board Game Arena, where you have people who we'll play Gaia Project, we'll play Terra Mystica over 100 times and have that more instinctual reaction of this is the right move than I may have developed. So I will not play a heavy game real time on Board Game Arena. I will not play Gaia Project on Board Game Arena on anything but asynchronous. Because there's simply too much to think about in that game. And I know that I will make very suboptimal moves under a 3-minute time pressure when I could think for 10 minutes about what my turn actually is and should be. So I elect to do asynchronous every time. Maybe it would be more interesting, but I just feel that it's too much pressure to play well.
We've spent too long together, Pat, because I agree with you and was going to make exactly the same point. If the game
about
gets
Gaia
really,
Project?
Well, I was going to actually bring up Gaia Project. And it's also that way with A Feast for Odin for me.
Yes.
Is if the game gets too dense and too complicated, then it just stops being fun. And like you said, gives a huge advantage to the person who's played it a million times. I will still play the timed version if I'm playing with friends or something. You know what I mean? Or if it's a game that I've, feel like I've gotten down to a T. But even having played a lot of Gaia Project, I feel like online I'd rather just play a solo game from Steam than I would just having to move maniacally fast with strangers. Feast for Odin, not quite so bad, but yeah, it's it's one thing. I do enjoy those fast games with friends, to be honest with you, because you don't feel quite so, when you're playing with strangers on Board Game Arena, if you go 1 second over the time limit, they'll just kick you out of the game. That's the kind of pressure that I don't want. I don't mind my friends screaming at me. That doesn't bother me.
You prefer it even.
and then you'll just move fast just from social pressure, and everyone's under the same social pressure, and that's okay. So yeah, with friends I don't mind the time limits, but yeah, with strangers, especially strangers who are never say a word and are really good players and are going to kick you out as soon as you're 1 second over the time limit, I don't enjoy that.
Well, like most things in board games, it depends on the friends. So I have some friends that Tina and I are friends with that we play board games with frequently, and they are primarily social friends rather than game friends. Some friends you have because of a similar hobby. These are friends who are social friends who happen to enjoy the same hobby. And I find myself more and more not wanting to play heavier, longer games with them because I see that there becomes a competing pressure for longer games within a given game night of hanging out together, of making a choice. I can A, be social and talk to these people and kind of play the game, or B, I can not talk to them and I can focus on the gameplay and play the game instead of being friends. And I find that that's a restriction that I have to deal with when playing any game of significant length with folks who are more friend forward and social forward rather than game and interest and shared hobby forward.
I agree, but I would also add the point that that's particularly influenced by us reviewing board games and playing new games all the time. If I'm playing The Voyages of Marco Polo, which I've played 100 times, I can play that game in my sleep. I can play that game and chat with you all day long and make my moves quickly, or not. If you ask Big John, maybe I don't make my moves quickly all the time, but I don't feel that pressure if I know the game inside out. You know what I mean? I can still talk and play.
But can your friends who haven't played the game over 100 times and are just learning it?
Well, then we just have more space for them to think. You know what I mean? When somebody's learning a game, then you just have more space for them.
Right. Then you need a longer time and less time pressure.
Right. But when in some of those games, when a lot of us have played it a ton of times, and you've got that's the joy of a dedicated game group for a particular game or games, is that you can chat and still play the dense game, right? And that fulfills that there. But yeah, it's not fun to be learning a new game and introducing it to a game group and everybody's playing for the first time, and then you're trying to enforce some sort of time thing. I mean, the most social thing you try to do there is try to say, hey, it's a first play. We're all going to make mistakes in our first play, and try to sort of enforce that first play ethos of, just let's get through this.
Well, you can guess whether I ever played with that group of Eclipse enthusiasts again. I think that they never wanted to play that game or see those people ever again, even though it was a very memorable and enjoyable experience. It was also a disastrous one.
I would have enjoyed being part of that Eclipse experience.
Or at least being a fly on the wall. Playing a real-time game or playing a game that has a time pressure, it forces you to be suboptimal, and that makes for fun, clever, memorable experiences because you end up lowering your own ceiling and doing your best with it.
Yeah, and it really it gets very player dependent. My friend Jordan, who we've talked about, is the fastest game player I've ever seen, and he'll literally be playing. If you're playing him on Board Game Arena, he'll be playing like doing 3 different things at the same time and still moving twice as fast as you. But the problem with that is that when somebody's really much faster than the other player, they just start to get bored. Or worse, feel taken advantage of, that you're taking longer to make moves, and the time pressure can create weird social situations, obviously, and it also has to do with game choice, and it enforces this choice for shorter games so that you're going to be able to get it done. There's nothing worse than that heavy game you're starting and you're like, okay, there's a 3-hour game and we got 2.5 hours, but I think we can squeeze it in.
Yeah.
Which was what you did in Eclipse, and it can create a funny situation, but it's not a long-term recipe for joy in your game group.
Yeah, I can't remember the last time that I just casually decided to play a 2.5-hour game. It's been a long time, Tony.
And there are also games that take away these pressures, or games that add that. When you say a game induces analysis paralysis, the game that you find yourself in these time issues with people. And it's certain considerations. It's games where you can't think about your turn on another player's turn because the situation changes so much, right? And it's that complicated. So, and it balances things like interactivity. When you have a super interactive game that also has a ton of crunch to it, then the time constraints can get very tough. Like, let's say you're playing Barrage, right? You can't just calculate your whole turnout in advance because people are going to take what you need and do things, right? But you really do need to calculate, so that you're just never going to have turns that go fast in that game.
Yeah. head down Euros, where you've got a set number
head
of
down
rounds.
Euros that are not interactive.
Right, exactly. Where you have a set number of rounds where, you might hit each other sometimes, but generally it's the same number of turns, and generally it is actually what it says on the box, an hour and a half.
And by the way, I think this
those make sense to play under a time limit.
Explains some of the reason why, in the last 20 years, games have gotten less interactive, because they do take away the time pressure in the sense that you can do that calculating on other players' turns if other people can't mess with you, and keep the flow moving. Interactivity can slow the game down.
Yeah, it's why you can play Marco Polo 100 times, or Orleans 100 times, because it's predictable, and yes, there's some interaction, but they're more predictable points of interaction, and you start to realize what the people are going to do around you.
If the interaction is solely limited to blocking in a straightforward way, then you can sit there on your turn thinking, okay, I have plan A, plan B, and plan C, depending on what's taken.
Right.
Oh,
they got the black dice. I thought they would get the black dice. That makes sense. I had a plan B already.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else on time restrictions?
I mean, we could get into individual game examples and do this all night, but I think we'd love to hear. This is a great one for stories, right? So we'd love to hear from people on our Discord of hilarious stories when time restrictions led to some sort of weird disaster.
Has anyone ever grabbed a megaphone and screamed at you to take your turn whilst playing a game? If so, tell us on our Discord in the show notes. Also, check us out at woodforawheat@gmail.com if you want to write us. Check out Tony's blog. He's at Max Longstreet, The Secrets of Great Games on Board Game Geek. Visit our website, twoodforawheat4.com. And what do we have coming up, Tony? I actually don't know.
I don't know. We've got some possibilities. Federation is a possibility. This new game group here in New Jersey, we might, Mosaic is a possibility, depending on what I get to the table with them there. We could also come back to some more of these AEG games.
We also have, Point City and Deep Dive sitting in the wings here.
Let us know in the Discord when this comes out, which of those you're dying to see reviewed, and maybe we'll take that into consideration, or maybe we won't.
Well, thanks for listening, folks. Stay frosty. We'll see you next time.
Take care, folks.
Two Wood for a Wheat is recorded across the airwaves in Bear Creek, Pennsylvania, and Chicago, Illinois. We're produced by Tony Faber and edited by Patrick Flannery. Follow us on Instagram at TWFAW and find more episodes and blog posts at twowoodforawheat.com.
Nature calls this old man.
Go for it.
This is going to be tricky because the dogs have settled in so nicely and they're not going to like me leaving.
Do you have a coffee cup nearby?
I finished my coffee before coming down.
Perfect. If you've got the cup nearby, you're good to go.
The dogs have been angels. You got to admit, this has not been a consideration today. You have not had to edit barks. You're not going to be editing barks today.
Commence the growling.